Hello, hello! If you're new here, my name is Dana, and under the name DL Pitchford, I publish unapologetically honest stories with real characters. And today I want to talk about some of my favorite tropes to read and to write, the different kinds of stories I like to explore, and the characters and relationships I like to delve into. This video is inspired by one that C.K. Jensen put out a few weeks ago, where they talked about some of their favorite tropes, and it got me really excited about doing my own version of that. So here we are. I threw together a long list of story aspects that I like to explore, and like different character archetypes and different genre conventions that I really enjoy, and I tried to divide them up into different categories to make it more organized, and that was kind of unsuccessful because a lot of them, it's hard to break down exactly where it would go and what it falls under. So I'm just kind of going to start big scale and slowly move down to small scale aspects. I'll be talking about theme and genre conventions, character and relationship dynamics, and also just like small picture things. Probably the number one thing to mention is dark, heavy topics. Because even when I wrote a YA romance, so much of it was about grief and death and bullying and parental expectations. I don't know how not to write heavy topics into my stories. That was supposed to be relatively lighthearted, and it did not come out that way. It's honestly a pretty sad book. A lot of my books wind up being pretty sad or depressing, which is one of the like dark and heavy topics that I like to talk about a lot, that I like to delve into. Mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD. A lot of those things I have explored in all of my stories to some extent. Trauma in general, especially in relation to a lot of the other elements that I am going to talk about. Another one that's really big for me is sex and sexuality. I have used books to explore my own sexuality quite a bit. Who We Might Have Been, which is the third Billy book, a lot of that book was me exploring my own bisexuality. How I feel about that part of myself that I don't often get to explore because I am married to a man and have children. So exploring that in fiction is really the only way I have to interact with that part of myself in an intimate way. Unfortunately, because Billy's love interest was already determined long before I wrote that book, she does not wind up with the female character. So that is definitely something I intend to explore more in depth in other works. And then related to sex and sexuality, pregnancy and motherhood is another thing that I really like exploring. I'm just going to use that word a whole lot in this probably, because that's what writing is in so many ways. It is a journey of a lot of times self-exploration. That's a lot of what's fun about it. I have my own hang-ups about pregnancy and motherhood in general. I feel like most women do. No matter how good your experience is, there are aspects of both that are not good. And I think it's really interesting to explore that, especially like in a dark way, in a horror genre especially, which I have yet to do, but I 100% intend to. Like, I love the Alien series. The whole series is about motherhood and pregnancy because chest burster. And then also horror movies like Rosemary's Baby. I just watched Hereditary for the first time a week or two ago, and it was the scariest horror movie I have watched in a long time. It was so much, but all of that is exploring that in a nuanced and different way. I have explored pregnancy in some of my stories already. In the one I'm working on right now, it is a huge factor in that. I've written about it from a literary perspective, but I want to delve into it more from a horror genre perspective. Other big tropes that I really like to dive into, feminine power, feminist rage, a whole range of all of that. And as I write more queer stories, I do want to dive into that aspect too, exploring queer rage and queer joy and, you know, all aspects of that. I also really love angst and like this deep self-loathing. Like, I love when a character blames themselves for something bad happening that's only tangential actually their fault, because that's human nature in a lot of ways. We often seek cause and effect, and that works well in stories, but that's not how real life actually works most of the time. There are aspects of that, but so much of our lives are legitimately random. And I do like to bring that randomness into stories. I mean, I write literary fiction, and even like my genre fiction leans in the literary style. Another theme that really stands out to me is, what does it mean to be a monster? This is why I really like Frankenstein. It is perhaps my favorite of classic literature, but also why I like stories about werewolves and vampires and a lot of those like stereotypical Halloween monsters, but then looking at them from a different perspective, looking at them from an inward perspective. Because what's always the most fascinating is that our internal monsters are always scarier than what we think a monster is. And in fiction, those big, physical, scary monsters are generally an analogy for something internal. And that does connect to my more genre-esque tropes on this list. That's a lot of why I really love body horror, being transformed against your will. Hanahaki is another one that, I love it so much. I recently read Don't Let the Forest In, and right now I'm reading Hazelthorn, both by C.G. Drews. And Don't Let the Forest In was not explicitly Hanahaki, but the vibes were there. Hazelthorn is much more in that direction, but I'm reading these and I so desperately want to write a Hanahaki book. It's just such a fun and angsty story. I want to do it. And it would give me the opportunity to dive into some of my favorite horror subgenres, like botanical eco-horror, so much fun, fantasy horror, sci-fi horror. I know that's such a big group. I'm trying to think if there is any version of sci-fi horror that I dislike though. Cosmic horror, so good. And of course, psychological horror, which is another one where that's really overarching. The point is more I like it when it is about the trauma. It's about the trauma. I want the trauma. I want to explore the trauma. Fantasy and sci-fi have always been really big genres for me. I've always loved them. I definitely prefer hard sci-fi, but I don't think I could actually write that. That requires an expertise, which I don't have. I can do a bunch of research. Research can make up for a lot of lack of experience, but it cannot make up for all of it. Hard sci-fi requires so much working knowledge. I love it, but I don't think I can do that. What I can do, and what I am constantly researching and reading and just learning about in general, is fairy tales and folklore. I've talked about that a whole bunch. It is one of my favorite things. I could talk about it for hours, and I intend to. I really love retellings and reimaginings of fairy tales and folklore, classic literature. I am a bit of a literature snob. I will admit to that. I talked about werewolves and vampires. I also really love ghost stories and hauntings, demons. I like witches and witchcraft, but mostly looking at it from a historical standpoint, looking at it from the perspective of this was a means of repressing women, as opposed to wizard school, yay. I think I would be much more into writing a witch and wizard academy story if the focus was on the oppression aspect and the trauma. It's all about the trauma. This is related to my love of classic literature and fairy tales, but I really love period pieces. I especially love the Victorian time period, and Regency is also really interesting. If we're going US, which is where I live, I love Wild West, Civil War time period, which is the same time period, to be clear. Also, I find westward expansion really interesting, the Oregon Trail, Lewis and Clark, that sort of time period. I have not written anything in most of those time periods. I do have a Weird West fiction that I've written, but it's a fantasy Weird West, where it takes place in a completely alternate world with magic, and then my main character is a bandit, being pursued by a sheriff, and being forced to join a war that she doesn't want to be a part of. My dad really loves Westerns, so I grew up watching them. I've seen probably every Clint Eastwood movie, and then, there are Western classics like Shane and Silverado and stuff like that. So I really love Westerns. There's something about the genre conventions that are just like so fun. So many of like the old pulp sci-fi fiction is like Western based. Or you have space Westerns like Firefly and Cowboy Bebop and other stuff like that, where there's something about it, it just works. And related to that, I love noir. Noir is something where it kind of is like what Western turned into in the city. Noir is obviously so much darker and grittier, which is why I have an affinity with it. There are actually quite a few Western noir films, so it's not weird to smush those together. It is something where there's an overlap between the two genres, and it's just so fun to combine them. This is a little bit related to like dark academia, which I have been really into lately. I, to an extent, always have been. I grew up watching Dead Poets Society. I love that movie. That is like one of my favorite movies, and also stuff like Ninth House, which very quickly became one of my favorite books. I love secret societies and like exclusive clubs. I feel like I've always really loved this. I'm pretty sure it's the tism of like wanting to be in a special group where you know exactly where you belong. Everyone's on the same page, there's rules and guidelines, and there's nobody who is on the outside looking in, because all the people who know about it are a part of it. As far as characters and relationship dynamics, I love found family. I love toxic and codependent friendships. I love messy family dynamics, like where you really want to be in this situation, you love these people, but there's something blocking the way. There's something that is making it not work. That's basically all of my Billy books are all about messy family dynamics. I like my main female characters to be bitchy and unlikable. That is my preference. That is my ideal. The amount of comments or reviews that I've gotten where I hate your main character, I'm like, yes, more. Because if I wrote that character as a dude doing the exact same stuff, at least half of the people who have commented complaining about it wouldn't complain at all. When Rachel Harrison was here, she did her talk at the library where she talked about Play Nice, her most recent book. I read it. It was fantastic. I had to buy a copy there so she could sign it because I listened to the audio through the library. That was one of the things she specifically talked about, how all of the main female characters that she had written prior had been called unlikable for one reason or another, no matter how she wrote them. So she just decided, screw it, I'm going to take all of the most unlikable things that women aren't supposed to do, how they're not supposed to behave, and put that into one character, and that's the main character, and you have to deal with it. And I love that. That is what I want. That is the ideal. Rachel Harrison was great. I was so pleased to be at her talk, to be able to hear her talk. It was fantastic, and I have loved the 2 books of hers that I've read. I need to read more. As far as like romantic relationships, obviously, I already talked about wanting to have more bisexual characters, to really be bisexual forward in my stories. I want the rep. I want a bisexual awakening. I am going to be the bi that I want to see in the world. I love friends to lovers. I love enemies to lovers. They're both great. But the ideal is enemies to friends to lovers, because it's the best of both worlds. And I will say most enemies to lovers do actually include a friendship stage, even if it's not that big. Not all of them. Definitely not all of them. But a lot of enemies to lovers do have a little bit of friendship there in between first. I love sun and moon pairings, dog cat, like those kinds of relationship dynamics. That is my favorite. I love a love interest who is so hopelessly devoted and like head over heels in love, even if they refuse to admit it, especially when that love interest is a dude. There's something about a man being so helplessly in love with a woman that is appealing as a woman. That makes sense. And related to that, I love mutual pining. That's the kind of angst that I really love. The requited, unrequited unrequited love, where you think the other person doesn't love you back, but actually they do. And the other person thinks the exact same thing because they're dumb. Like two idiots in love is my favorite. Yeah, give me the mutual pining. That's the best. The yearning is the yearning. And then we get to more like small picture things. So I love like floral imagery, flowers, florography, and Hanakatoba especially. Hanakatoba is the Japanese version of florography. It was inspired by Victorian florography. There's a lot of overlap in the flower meanings in both of those. I love all of that stuff though, and as I write more Victorian time period stuff, I do want to include more florography stuff. And obviously, like, that's a great opportunity. If you're doing Hanahaki, you need to be thinking about the meaning behind the flowers, the plants that are being used in that. I really love books, about literature and like libraries. The Doctor Who Silence in the Library episodes are so good. Also stuff like The Shadow in the Wind, The 13th Tale. Those were some of my favorite books that I read in high school. They left a huge impact. Also stuff like Inkheart. That's just such a good series. I love winter imagery, storms, like a downpour of rain, all of that kind of stuff, whether for the sake of setting the tone or creating hazardous situation, something completely out of our control, and just like the metaphors that we can create using it. Camping and bonfires. Camping was something I did a lot. As a kid, my family would go on camping trips, and there's something so fun and exciting about basically being stranded but choosing to be. And then, you know, you're really towing the line of like, okay, but what if we really get stuck out here, like Blair Witch Project or something like that. It is such a good situation to put characters in, especially for a horror. I also like really love summer camp vibes. That is absolutely because of movies like The Parent Trap and Addams Family Values, because they really just like everything about that is so fun, especially if Wednesday Addams is also there. And that also creates a fun opportunity for things like cryptids, which I'm also pretty into right now. I really love Bigfoot. He's so cute. But cryptids in general, and I really want to like do stories that explore that. Some of the X-Files cryptids episodes were some of my favorites. Treasure Hunts is another really big one, and I'm pretty sure I can trace that back to Oversea Under Stone, which is the first book in Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series, which is like one of the best middle grade series, period. It's all like Arthurian legends, it's a British kids, Merlin, time travel, magic. It's so good. But that first book is about three siblings who, under their great uncle Mary's guidance, find a treasure map and have to hunt for it and find, I'm pretty sure it's like the Holy Grail, before these like agents of evil find it first. If you haven't read that series, what are you doing with your life? Another element I really like in like fantasy stories or paranormal stories, like magical tattoos and markings. I remember one story that I was writing when I was really young. They had like barcodes on the back of their necks. It was like a very soft sci-fi or paranormal kind of thing that I was writing with my sister. That's still just such a fascinating concept. It's so fun. That is basically everything that I have written down, but generally all of my stuff includes undercurrents of anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism and anti-censorship. Like, these are things that are ingrained into my being, even if I'm not like particularly speaking on that in a work. There are hints of it, and that is something that I do want to explore more in depth when I have more experience under my belt. Like, I've been writing for a long time, and I've, published a few books, but there are still some topics that I do not want to tackle in depth yet. It requires more time, more research, more experience, and I'll get there eventually. That is all I have on my list. If you have not watched C.K. Jensen's video, their version of this, you you should definitely go do that. It's so fun to be able to do this and compare favorite tropes. We definitely have a lot of overlap, and even if we don't write what the other person writes, I read and enjoy pretty much everything that they listed. So it's just fun to be in conversation about this, and I really hope that other people make more videos like this. It would be so cool to see what everyone likes, to see what makes them go feral, because that's what this is. That's what this list is. Anyway, thanks for watching. I have one more video coming out after this year, a kind of wintry Christmas vlog, and then you won't see me until my 2026 author goals video at the beginning of January. See you later!